We have an outstanding program for you today with a special group of speakers. It's not every day that one gets the opportunity to introduce our first two speakers. I'd like to take you back and borrow the words from an event that took place in April of 1998 at the White House. At that time, the acting director for the National Science Foundation, Neil Lane, was introducing one of our speakers for today. I quote, and this was in 1998, by the way. Over 2 decades ago, there was a lone member of Congress that was farsighted enough to see that our ability to harness the power and promise that leading-edge advances in technology would determine, in very large measure, our prosperity, our security, and our global influence, and with them, our standard of living, our quality of life for all our people in the 21st century. That strong voice was Vice President Al Gore. In fact, he is the one that coined the term the information highway. So we're very fortunate to have with us the former congressman, senator, and vice president of the United States, Mr. Al Gore, who also just happens to be a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a best-selling author, an environmentalist, and a pure champion for the internet and technology. The other person that I get the great honor to introduce is one of the architects and designers of the basic architecture and protocols of the original internet, a true pioneer, Mr. Vint Cerf, who is also an awardee of a Presidential Medal of Freedom, an internet evangelist, and a friend to so many of you watching today. We had the honor of his company as a keynoter over a year ago at one of our big events. And of course, he remains the best-dressed techie in the world. To get us started, I would like to ask both of you one question, and then we'll enjoy a conversation between the two of you. At some point, you both met and started sharing and talking about your shared vision related to the foundation of the internet. Can you take us back to that conversation, to that first time or the first seed towards what then grew? Let's call it the germination point. Where were you? How did it go? Take us back to that moment. So without further ado, it is a privilege of a lifetime, but an absolute honor and privilege for me to welcome former Vice President Al Gore and Internet Evangelist Dr. Vint Cerf to open today's program. Take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Anna. And what a pleasure to see you, Vice President Gore. This is a special treat since we don't see each other very often. Anna's presumption actually needs some refinement, and so I'm going to take you back to 1986. You will recall that you hosted a hearing as senator, and in the course of that hearing, Bob Cohn was present, and he brought up a term, the National Information Infrastructure. And as I recall, your reaction to that was to think about that as the information superhighway, partly, I think, because your father, the senior Al Gore, had introduced a defense act to create the interstate highway system. And I think you saw this as an analog to that in the digital world. But that led, I think, to the next step. You asked a question at the end of that hearing. You asked, at least according to Bob Cohn's rendering, whether it would make sense to build a fiber optic network to connect the supercomputers that NSF was sponsoring. And what is it that promoted that idea in your mind?
Well, thank you, Vint. And I want to acknowledge Anna Hunsinger, Vice President for Community Engagement for Internet 2, and to all of the other distinguished guests. And Vint, it's true that we don't get to see each other in person as much as we used to, particularly with the pandemic. But I'll say, Anna, Vint's not only the best dressed internet evangelist, but he also knows where the best restaurants in the world are too. And we've been making plans when we can get together again. But enough of that. Let me try to respond to your question, Vint. Actually, it goes back to something that you mentioned. I remember when I was a boy of 5 and 6 years old, when my father, as a father myself, I later learned what my dad was doing. He had to keep me with him, and he took me to his hearings in the Senate. And he was chairman of the subcommittee that actually, and he wrote the legislation establishing the interstate highway system. It's often attributed to President Eisenhower, but I remember so vividly one of the lessons he taught me when we were driving on old Highway 70 from our farm in Carthage, Tennessee to Nashville, Tennessee. And it was in the evening, and he said, "Son, you see all of those tail lights stretching out in front of us and all of the headlights coming in the opposite direction. Why is this road so crowded now?" And he answered his own question by saying that after World War II, people began to buy so many cars and trucks that the old two-lane road network was no longer sufficient. And that's really one of the main motivations that caused him to propose the interstate highway system. And later, when I was a student in college, really focusing on information theory and policy in the government department, I ran across a law that didn't have a name yet, wasn't called a law. Gordon Moore had already noticed the doubling of the number of transistors that could be put on a chip, and the exponential increase in the amount of information that was being processed locally in these larger and ever more powerful computers presented a gross mismatch with the equivalent of the two-lane roads, the twisted copper pair wires that had been put in place for voice communication, which doesn't require much bandwidth, could not connect the rich and highly productive activity conducted on supercomputers. But if they could be connected, then everything would change. And so it was a direct analogy. And the information superhighway meme, which I defended vigorously when people proposed Infobon, and I remember some of the other also rans or also drives. And you know, if you defend the language, then that's a handhold in gaining power over the concepts. And one of the other lessons that my dad taught me was that when the federal government put this interstate highway system in place, then local communities and states began to connect much larger access roads to the interstate highway system. So it was not really a difficult leap from the conceptual linkage between more capacity on the road networks for the much higher volume of traffic, because it was really a waste of productive energy to have these magnificent, ever more powerful computers that couldn't be used in combination. So yes, that's what led to that meme and led to the proposals that I advanced after that. And you and Bobby Kahn were my mentors in learning about the more detailed and significant facts that you knew that I had to learn from you. And what a joy it was to work with you, Vint. And may I say to others on this, if you want a friend who is loyal and always has your back, Vint Cerf is your guy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice President. Let me skip ahead a few years now, a couple of incidents and then a question. In 1988, the Federal Networking Council agreed to allow a commercial network service called MCI Mail to be connected to the NSF-Net backbone, which was essentially breaking the permitted use, the appropriate use restrictions on the government backbones, which said no commercial traffic. So we sort of broke that barrier in 1988. And then in 1991, the National Science Foundation began an international connections program that allowed international connections to be made and underwritten by NSF, which spread the internet more fully to other parts of the world. And then in 1992, you may recall something that I think was called the Boucher Bill, which officially permitted commercial traffic to traverse the then U.S. internet backbones, the NSFnet, the Energy Sciences Network, and the NASA Science Internet. So now you're on the cusp of becoming vice president at that point. And what I'm wondering about is, as you entered into that new role, what were your thoughts about the internet? You may remember some pretty important steps that you and President Clinton took, but I want you to go back to the early 1993 period. What's on your mind with regard to the NSFnet and the internet at that point?
Well, I was very steeped in it, Van, and partly because of my friendship with you and Bobby and others, and the hearings that I had. When I was in the House, actually, when I first joined the House, I began to have informal gatherings. I remember trying to persuade the then head of AT&T, when it was still Ma Bell, to support this idea of an information superhighway. And it was a wake-up call for me, because he didn't have zero interest. He had negative interest. This was a man named Charles Brown. The only business leader I could interest in this was the head of Corning Glass. Now, I wonder what he was thinking. They were, Corning was quite interested in it. And then I introduced legislation, and people have trouble remembering that there was a time when there was bipartisanship in the Congress. And I had help from Republicans, and the legislation that put $1 billion a year into the development of the switches and protocols and all of the changes that needed to be made in order to accommodate the linkage of these supercomputers. Initially, and it established the supercomputer centers around the world and a demonstration network. And NSFnet, of course, was before that NREN, the National Research and Education Network, was really intended to link all of the places that had these supercomputers. Of course, now an iPhone has more processing power than most all of them put together back in that day, but that's an old story. But what was in my mind, we had passed the legislation. The first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, had a science advisor named D. Allen Bromley. I tangled him on global warming policy and didn't get anywhere for reasons we don't need to go into. But he actually did respond to my efforts to persuade him, and through him, President Bush, on what became the internet. And we got that legislation passed. Actually, even though it had a lot of money and it was brand new, it passed unanimously with a bipartisan vote. I remember Newt Gingrich, before he became a hyper-partisan Speaker of the House, he and I were close friends and allies, and we've worked together episodically on a few things since then. But and I've never criticized him in spite of much provocation because we were friends. But that was what was on my mind, to get this out there and begin seeing the advantages that would come from having this connection. And of course, we also included in the 90s, there was a problem of limited access in rural areas. And so we took the telecommunications fund that was originally designed to give farmers and rural communities telephone service and expanded it to include access to computer networks. And I remember the members of the other party began to call it the Gore tax, which they thought was going to be a devastating critique. But when it became so popular, the name Gore tax, much to my chagrin, disappeared from the lexicon.
We're going to run out of time, and I want to make sure to get one other question on the table. The NSFNet was retired in 1995, and it was replaced by a bunch of network access points, and it really promoted the commercialization of the internet. Then in 96, there was a revision of the Telecom Act, and I remember that there was another event that year, Net Day, and you and President Clinton rolled up your sleeves and you were pulling Ethernet in the schools. So I just to remind people of, how far we've come since then. Wi-Fi, of course, is widely available. But I'd like to ask you in the last 2 minutes that we have to speak a little bit about the role of internet, especially in the COVID pandemic, but also in this continued threat of climate change. What role could it play? How can we help?
Well, thank you for asking. And of course, the pandemic, for all of the dark tragedies and policy failures, it has actually simultaneously accelerated many changes that were already underway. Even though you and I, Vint, have been using this technology for so long, I don't think I fully appreciated how much its use would expand when we had these lockdowns. It's incredible. I look back at the speeches I made way back in the day saying, one day even businesses will be connected to the internet. Even students will be connected. I had one story that I would always tell about a little girl in Carthage, Tennessee, population 2,000, coming home from school and connecting to the Library of Congress and getting access to all of the knowledge collected there. And so connecting the schools was really important. And now in this pandemic, we have seen an ability to use this magnificent technology in ways that were difficult to imagine before. And we are also seeing the dramatic advantages of the internet in dealing with the climate crisis. Just before this session, Vint, we were going back and forth on texting and email about it. I was speaking to a parliamentary gathering in London about the upcoming conference of the parties in Glasgow, and this was going to be canceled, but they said, hey, let's just do it on the internet. And so we had everybody's had that experience recently, and thank goodness we do have this capacity.
Thanks so much for joining us, Vice President Gore. And I look forward to another opportunity to get together again when it's safe. And in the meantime, amen to that. And in the meantime, I'll see you on the net.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks so much, Anna. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vint and Mr. Gore. What an honor. Thank you for giving us a bit of your time today. And thank you so much for this very enlightening and fun session. I cannot help but reflect back again to that famous White House meeting in April 1998, where then NSF Director Neil Lane also famously said, as he introduced Mr. Gore, that the announcement about the development of the next generation computer network will dramatically underscore just how vital technological leadership is to the national interest of the United States. Mr. Lane could not have said it better. On behalf of the research and education community, I'd like to thank you both very much for being here today. And thank you for all that you have done in supporting innovation for our country, for the world, and for our communities across research and education.